The sound of polished wood cracked as my chair scraped backward, his words echoing, "Payroll oversight is obsolete overhead." My face burned, not from shame, but disbelief. After 10 years keeping 8,400 workers paid on time, I was erased with a smirk. Around the table, no one spoke. Yet in my tote sat one red-tabbed binder, the single signature every paycheck depended on. They thought they'd cut fat. What they severed was the artery. And by 9:01 a.m., AmeriMart's bloodstream would feel it. Before I go further, where are you watching from? Drop your city and hit subscribe. This one detail changes everything. Mark Reynolds, our CEO, stood at the head of the boardroom table with his perfect Windsor knot and his voice dripping with fake confidence. "We're eliminating outdated payroll oversight," he announced, pausing just long enough for every pair of eyes to turn toward me. My stomach tightened, heat rushing to my face as if the air itself had been weaponized. 10 years of holding the system together, 10 years of making sure 8,400 workers got paid on time, erased in a single sentence. He didn't even say my name, just painted me as dead weight, a relic clogging his shiny vision of efficiency. My pen slipped from my hand, clattering onto the wood in a silence so sharp it cut deeper than any insult. Tracy from HR shifted in her seat. Paul, the CFO, stared at his notes, but no one said a word. That was the humiliation. Not just Mark's smirk, but the cowardice of every witness pretending this wasn't happening. I stood, smoothing my skirt with steady hands, refusing to let him see me break. I gave him nothing. Not a tear. Not a protest. Only my silence. Inside, though, rage coiled tight, because I knew something Mark didn't. In my drawer sat a binder, every renewal date marked, every compliance deadline flagged, and one certification circled in red ink. The only thing keeping AmeriMart's payroll alive was my signature. He thought he cut fat. What he severed was the artery, and the whole body was about to bleed out. The fracture had been running through AmeriMart long before Mark Reynolds erased me in that boardroom. I was the only person in the corporation certified under federal law to release payroll, a designation earned through years of exams, audits, and government vetting. That certification wasn't ornamental. It was the lock and key on every dollar that flowed from AmeriMart's accounts to its people. Without my sign-off, no paychecks cleared, no vendors got settled, no schedules could run. Mark thought payroll oversight was dead weight, but I was the ignition switch that kept the machine alive. In my audit binder, deadlines screamed in red ink, renewal dates stacked like dominoes waiting to fall. I had emailed, flagged, and even raised the point in meetings, but Paul, the CFO, preferred balance sheets to compliance notes, and Tracy from HR skimmed right past anything that wasn't about recruiting metrics. They wanted shiny numbers to parade before investors, not boring reminders that rules had teeth. What they never understood was that payroll wasn't just a function, it was the bloodstream of the company, and my certification was the artery valve. Remove it, and the whole system would seize. They mistook silence for weakness and paperwork for clutter, but every page in that binder was a fuse. Each ignored alert brought the company closer to detonation. That was the fault line, buried under glossy presentations and buzzwords, invisible to the arrogant, but real enough to snap the moment pressure hit. And once it gave way, nothing could hold back the collapse. It started quietly, the kind of reminder most executives skim and forget. On Thursday afternoon, an automated system notice flagged the wage compliance certification as pending renewal, authorization required. The wording was sterile, but I knew what it meant. By Monday, the system would either recognize a certified officer's renewal or lock entirely. I forwarded the alert to Paul, our CFO. His response was a single word: acknowledged. No urgency, no plan, just a brush off. Hours later, Tracy from HR added her usual sugarcoat, assuring me IT will handle it. But IT couldn't touch federal certification. That authority was bound to my login, my fingerprint, my name. Their replies told me everything. They didn't understand. And worse, they didn't care. I printed the alert, slid it into my binder, and drew a hard circle around the deadline. That binder wasn't a collection of papers. It was a survival manual built from years of ignored warnings. Each tab marked a potential fracture, and this one glowed red. Friday morning, Mark strode through headquarters rehearsing lines for his investor call, bragging about efficiency gains and digital transitions. I sat silently at my desk, watching him polish illusions while the real system ticked toward shutdown. Around me, teams wrapped up reports, joked about weekend plans, completely unaware that payroll, the lifeblood of every store, every vendor, every worker, was already in countdown mode. I didn't remind them again. I had learned that warnings were wasted on people who treat consequences as optional. Instead, I closed my office drawer, tucked the binder into my tote, and let the weight of it rest against my shoulder like a quiet weapon. When I walked out that evening, the lobby was filled with laughter, staff rushing off to catch flights or happy hours. They had no idea that their paychecks depended on a box no one but me could check. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a timer, steady and cold. That was the small trigger. Not a dramatic explosion, not sabotage, just one unchecked requirement built into the system itself. And when Monday morning came, the trigger would snap shut. One ignored certification, one missing signature, and AmeriMart's bloodstream would seize in silence, exposing exactly how fragile their empire really was. Monday morning at precisely 9:01 a.m., the first fracture appeared. AmeriMart's payroll system synced with the Department of Labor's compliance portal, and instead of the usual green confirmation, the screen turned red. Payment suspended. Compliance, renewal missing. At first, the finance team assumed it was a glitch, a harmless hiccup that could be smoothed over with a reboot. Paul, the CFO, brushed it off, telling his staff to refresh the dashboard and try again. Tracy from HR sent out a quick message reassuring employees that IT was on it. But nothing changed. The red alert stayed, stubborn and unblinking, a silent warning that the artery was already closing. Within minutes, the ripple spread. Direct deposit notifications failed to send, vendor invoices bounced back, and confused employees began flooding local managers with questions. Is payroll delayed? Why isn't my account updated? The answers were vague, dismissive, designed to buy time, but time was exactly what they didn't have. The system wasn't broken, it was functioning exactly as it was built to function. No valid certification, no disbursement. It was that simple. And yet, in their arrogance, leadership refused to see the danger. Mark Reynolds, still polishing his talking points for the upcoming investor call, hadn't even looked at the alerts. To him, payroll was a background process, too small to derail his grand narrative of modernization, but the crack was already spreading under his feet. The first crack wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was irreversible. Because payroll isn't just money, it's trust. The instant that trust falters, the system unravels. And all it took was one unchecked renewal, one missing signature to set the entire empire trembling. It didn't come with a bang. It came like a rising tide that no one could stop once it started. By mid-morning, the red screens were no longer confined to the finance office. They were multiplying across AmeriMart's entire network. Store managers from Chicago to Phoenix reported the same message: payroll blocked, wage disbursement suspended. Employees who had been expecting direct deposits woke up to empty accounts, rent unpaid, bills already overdue. The first wave of panic trickled in through customer service hotlines, but by 10:30 a.m., it became a flood. Phones rang nonstop with voices rising in anger and disbelief. Why hasn't my paycheck hit? Why is my vendor invoice rejected? At first, Paul, the CFO, tried to keep the lid on by drafting a bland memo calling it temporary system maintenance. But that lie couldn't stretch over the widening cracks. By noon, union representatives were demanding immediate answers, threatening to escalate with labor lawyers if funds weren't released. AmeriMart had always underestimated its workforce, treating payroll like a boring back-end process. But the truth was, the workforce was the bloodstream. And now the bloodstream had clotted. On social media, hashtags started trending. Hashtag AmeriMart unpaid. Hashtag where is my check? Photos of angry employees holding up overdraft notices appeared on Twitter. Posts tagged at AmeriMart headquarters drew thousands of shares. News outlets caught on before leadership could contain the fire. Local reporters framed it as corporate negligence. By early afternoon, national outlets had joined in, flashing headlines about AmeriMart's payroll freeze leaves thousands stranded. Meanwhile, vendors were pulling contracts. Shipping companies refused to dispatch goods without cleared payments. Suppliers demanded assurances that didn't exist. Tracy from HR scrambled with canned responses, sending emails promising resolution in 24 hours, but every delay only confirmed suspicion. Inside the stores, managers fielded shouting matches with staff demanding answers they didn't have. In one Midwest region, employees staged a walkout, locking the doors with signs taped to the glass, "Pay us first." That image hit the evening news. Mark Reynolds could no longer ignore the fracture. His investor call, meant to brag about efficiency, turned into a grilling. Analysts asked why wage funds weren't released, why unions were threatening lawsuits, why AmeriMart's credit rating was suddenly under review. Mark stammered about modernization and digital transitions, but his polished tone couldn't hide the panic swelling behind his eyes. The board wasn't impressed. They demanded an emergency meeting as the company's stock slid 8 points in a single afternoon. Every system that depended on payroll was unraveling. Scheduling froze because unpaid workers refused shifts. Logistics stalled because unpaid vendors halted deliveries. And customer service collapsed under the weight of fury from every direction. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't an accident. It was protocol. Doing exactly what it was built to do: protect the workforce from being ignored, enforce compliance by shutting down the flow of money until certified oversight was restored. And only one name was tied to that certification: mine. As the chaos spread like wildfire, AmeriMart's leadership finally realized the truth. They hadn't eliminated overhead. They had eliminated the keystone. And the empire they built on arrogance was now eating itself alive, one unpaid paycheck at a time. At 2:07 p.m., a formal notice landed in every executive inbox, stamped with the seal of the Federal Wage Compliance Bureau. Stop pay notice, AmeriMart Inc. All payroll disbursements and vendor settlements are frozen pending renewal of compliance certification. Effective immediately, the silence that followed was the kind that crushes lungs. Mark Reynolds, usually a man who loved the sound of his own voice, just stared at the document as if reading it harder might make it change. Paul, the CFO, broke first, muttering excuses about IT malfunctions until the Bureau's second notice arrived minutes later, clarifying that the system was not malfunctioning at all. It was locked exactly as designed, awaiting renewal from the designated certified officer. That officer was me, and I was gone. The board convened an emergency meeting that same afternoon. I wasn't there, but my phone lit up with messages from sympathetic colleagues describing the carnage. Mark paced the boardroom, face shiny with sweat, his voice cracking as he insisted it was a clerical oversight. One director cut him off sharply, asking why in God's name the only certified payroll officer had been eliminated during a cost-cutting stunt. Paul tried to claim the role was redundant, that others could step in. That's when Tracy, pressed beyond her limits, admitted in a small voice that no one else in AmeriMart held the certification, that training a new officer would take 6 to 12 weeks under federal guidelines. The board erupted. Chairs scraped, voices rose, papers slammed against the table. Numbers were recited like death tolls. $35 million frozen in payroll, 8,400 employees unpaid, dozens of vendors suspending deliveries, lawsuits already drafted. The company's entire labor force stood on the edge of revolt, and the stock had already lost nearly 15% by the time the market closed. The directors turned on Mark with venom. He tried to project calm, lifting his hands as if he could smooth the air, but the facade collapsed as quickly as the company around him. One director asked the question that cut through everything. "Did you personally authorize her termination?" Mark faltered, lips twitching, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Paul tried to step in, but the chairwoman silenced him with a glare. The answer was clear before Mark whispered it. Yes. The fallout was immediate. Legal laid out the paper trail I had so carefully left behind, every email warning of deadlines, every flagged risk, every ignored memo. Copies of my audit binder, still sitting in AmeriMart's servers, showed dates, contacts, and the red-circled certification renewal that had been dismissed as admin clutter. The evidence was a noose, and Mark had tied the knot himself. By evening, calls from union leaders grew louder, threatening nationwide strikes if wages weren't released. Vendors filed breach of contract notices. Government officials began circling for audits. The board realized they weren't facing a stumble. They were facing systemic failure, triggered by one arrogant decision to erase the person who held the only key. That was the collapse. Not a glitch, not sabotage, but the system obeying its own rules, a silent avalanche crushing everything built on the illusion that people like me were replaceable. I didn't watch it unfold in person. Instead, I sat in a quiet cafe across town, my binder beside me, a second coffee cooling untouched. My phone buzzed constantly. Unknown numbers, desperate emails, even a voicemail from Mark himself trying to sound conciliatory, asking for a temporary consultation. I deleted it without listening to the end. The collapse was complete. AmeriMart's empire had ground to a halt because they had mistaken the foundation for wallpaper. And now, the building was falling in on them, piece by piece, while I watched from a safe distance, calm as the dust settled. The fallout spread faster than even I expected. By Tuesday morning, AmeriMart's stock had plunged nearly 20%, and the headlines were merciless. AmeriMart freezes payroll for 8,400 workers. Vendors cut ties amid compliance scandal. Union lawyers filed injunctions demanding immediate back pay, and class action suits were drafted overnight. Vendors who had supplied AmeriMart for decades pulled contracts, citing breach of trust. The board, already reeling from shareholder fury, stripped Mark of his authority within 48 hours, though the damage was beyond salvaging. Inside the company, chaos turned into resignation. Employees staged protests outside flagship stores, waving signs that read, "We earned our pay." Managers couldn't recruit anyone to cover shifts, and entire regions shut down when workers refused to clock in. Vendors began calling AmeriMart toxic, a liability that no partner wanted to touch. Tracy from HR tried to save face by sending out company-wide emails about rebuilding trust, but by then her words carried the weight of smoke in the wind. Paul, the CFO, vanished behind his lawyers. Mark was forced to face the board again, this time without his silver tie and rehearsed lines, just a broken man cornered by the consequences of his own arrogance. And me? I didn't return a single call. My voicemail filled with pleas for temporary assistance, but I let the silence answer. I had no reason to rescue people who only saw me as expendable until the day their empire bled out. AmeriMart had mistaken the foundation for clutter, and now they were paying the price in full. The aftermath wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a slow suffocation, the kind that forces everyone to finally see what was always true. They had erased me, but in doing so, they erased themselves. When the dust finally settled, I had already stepped into a different world. The AmeriMart collapse played out like a cautionary tale across every business outlet, dissected by analysts who finally admitted what Mark and his board never could. Payroll compliance wasn't bureaucracy, it was survival. While they scrambled to salvage scraps of credibility, I sat across polished tables in meetings with competitors who wanted exactly what AmeriMart had thrown away. The same binder that had been ignored in my desk drawer became my passport. Regional chains, national suppliers, even a financial institution approached me with offers. They didn't want a consultant buried in the back office. They wanted authority, independence, and oversight that couldn't be brushed aside by executives chasing optics. I built my own consultancy, Carter Compliance Strategies, and within weeks I had contracts lined up. My first condition was always the same: direct authority on certification, no interference, no shortcuts. Companies signed without hesitation. They had seen what happened when that safeguard was dismissed. AmeriMart, meanwhile, bled talent and reputation. Their stores sat half-staffed, vendors demanded payment upfront, and the board cycled through interim leaders like band-aids on an artery that had already burst. None of it mattered to me anymore. I didn't gloat. I didn't seek revenge in headlines. My justice was quieter, sharper, knowing that my silence, my restraint, had let the system do exactly what it was designed to do. They severed the artery, and I walked away with the lifeblood. The resolution wasn't about destruction. It was about building something better, stronger, and entirely mine. AmeriMart became a warning, but I became the proof that undervaluing the invisible can collapse an empire. I learned something powerful from watching AmeriMart collapse after they erased me. It wasn't about revenge in the Hollywood sense. It was about how fragile corporate systems truly are when arrogance convinces leaders that the boring roles don't matter. Mark Reynolds thought payroll oversight was overhead, something to trim for optics. What he never grasped was that every empire rests on a network of small, invisible details, certifications, deadlines, compliance checks that don't shout until it's too late. Systemic fragility is everywhere. In today's corporate world, failures don't begin with dramatic scandals. They begin with ignored memos, dismissed warnings, and unchecked boxes. Think about the supply chain failures, banking glitches, or airline meltdowns we've all read about. Every single one started as a small crack that leaders ignored. You should feel cautious, maybe even angry, but also validated. Because if you've ever been dismissed when you raised a red flag, you already know how it feels to watch arrogance steamroll truth. My story proves that your instincts aren't paranoia. They're the guardrails that keep a system alive. The practical takeaway is simple: document everything. When you see fragility, write it down, escalate it, protect it. Fragile systems break on their own. You don't need to sabotage. You just need to stop shielding those who refuse to listen. How to get started today. Keep an audit folder of risks and deadlines. Speak up once, then let accountability fall where it should. Learn the regulations or rules that make your role indispensable. Never underestimate how one detail can flip an entire system. And now I'll leave it with you. Comment below if you've ever seen leadership ignore a small crack until it became a collapse. Share this story, subscribe, and let's make sure those lessons are never forgotten.